Doing these video talks is a new venture for me, and I'm just getting to grips with using the various technology I've got to hand in order to put them together. Usually they're done over a couple of days, and I quite often need to go back and put sections in between other sections as I think more clearly about the ideas that I want to put across. Now that it's pretty much done, I still find that there are one or two places where there's slight areas of maybe a little imprecision. Examples would be when I say the material world is over 95% empty space, but it's actually over 99% empty space, for example. When I talk about David Bohm, I don't point out that David Bohm had two different phases in his quantum interpretational career. The first phase was a materialistic one, the second phase was a more mystical one. Most people dealing with this subject focus on the pilot wave, the materialist David Bohm. When I use the term, I'm actually referring to the more interesting and more correct mystical phase of David Bohm's work. So, a pedant watching this video would maybe find these slight imperfections irritating. Rather than go back and put little sections in again, where I find slight adjustments need to be made, I've now just put some text at the bottom making the assertion more precise. And I apologise for sections which are out of focus. I used my video editor to make them as focused as possible. My face is out of focus. But as I was happy with what I was saying, I've left them in. I hope you find this useful and maybe hopefully informative. Thank you. Quantum physicists and philosophers often make statements of astonishment, such as Jim Al-Khalili has put on the back of his book, Quantum, which comes from Niels Bohr. If you are not astonished by quantum mechanics, then you have not understood it. But of course, it is the case that quantum physicists do regularly use very complex equations which relate to the quantum realm to calculate various results that they need in their work. Mathematically, the functioning of the quantum realm is known very well. Otherwise, the various wondrous pieces of technology we have, which rely on quantum functioning, would not work as well as they do. What is meant by such exclamations of astonishment is that many people find it difficult to understand how it is that a seemingly material world emerges from what seems to be an immaterial, insubstantial quantum realm of potentiality. This is the conundrum. How does solidity emerge from non-solidity, to put it one way? We can look at a couple of other statements of astonishment. Bryce DeWitt and Neil Graham, for example, both physicists, say, no development of science has had more profound impact on human thinking than the advent of quantum theory. Wrenched out of centuries-old thought patterns, physicists of a century ago found themselves compelled to embrace a new metaphysics. The distress which this reorientation caused continues to the present day. Basically, the physicists have suffered a severe loss, their hold on reality. And here, clearly, Bryce DeWitt and Neil Graham tell us that it is not the mathematical calculations which are problematic, it is the metaphysics, the philosophical understanding which goes along with those mathematical calculations, with the implications of those mathematical calculations. Before the quantum era, the material world was thought to be all there was, a material world, a solid material world of matter. Then suddenly, the material world seemed to disappear into a quantum realm of immaterial insubstantiality. How could this possibly be? Lee Smolin tells us, I have worked on projects in quantum gravity where everything went smoothly until the collaborators discovered one day over dinner that we had radically different understandings of the meaning of quantum theory. Everything went smoothly again after we had calmed down and realized that how we thought about the theory had no effect on the calculations we were doing. And he adds the following observation. It is true that there is only one mathematical formalism of quantum theory, so physicists have no problem in going ahead and using the theory, even though they do not agree about what it means. And it seems that when we look at the history of quantum theory or quantum mechanics, the founders of quantum theory, Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg and Schrödinger, did not agree. I have never understood where this astonishment comes from. For as long as I can remember, I have been astonished that there is a material world at all. I can remember lying in bed when I was quite young, I think in my early teens or maybe before that, wondering where the walls of my bedroom came from. It just seemed odd to me that solid stuff could come out of nothing. Where did all this stuff come from? I used to wander around town thinking, where did these houses come from? Where did these people come from? Does not make sense. There should be nothing. How can all this stuff come from nothing? So, the idea that there's some kind of immaterial ground which produces an illusion of some kind of a material reality seems far more plausible to me. But strangely, a lot of physicists, who it seems to me should know better, are astonished. I was also astonished that thoughts could actually arise from matter very early on. I remember walking back from choir practice, trying to figure out when I moved my arm, whether it was me who moved it or God who moved it. These kind of conundrums exercised my mind. When I started reading about quantum physics, especially after I'd read a few Buddhist texts, Buddhist philosophy texts, I was not astonished at all that the apparently material world arose from a deeper level which was immaterial in nature. In the last video that I did, the Observer Effect Part 1, I talked about a kind of pressure within the academic community, the scientific academic community, to clamp down and dissuade people from being interested or even asserting certain connections or certain metaphysical views concerning the nature of quantum theory. I refer to this as the anti-quantum mystical thought police. And I gave quotes from a couple of people. One of them was from Rosenblum and Kuttner, both quantum physicists, who were heavily criticized because they suggested there was a connection between consciousness and quantum phenomena. However, amongst a cabal of physicists who have more materialist leanings, such ideas are regularly met with scorn rather than intellectual analysis. And when you actually look at the evidence, there is absolutely no reason for this scorn apart from the fact that the physicists in general have a personal preference for a materialist explanation. In that previous video, I gave a short clip showing Sean Carroll, a materialist quantum physicist, quite clearly stating that his preference for materialism was in his heart, not in experimental evidence. We're now going to look at an interesting passage from Jim Al-Khalili, which indicates that he had some problems or issues with the academic thought police, who it seems were not happy with a certain direction he wanted to explore and write and publish about, I assume. Al-Khalili says, "Here was a potentially new field of research, bringing together quantum physics, organic chemistry, and molecular biology, in which there were still very few active researchers. You see, and to a large extent this is still true today, physicists are reluctant to believe that the tenuous rules of quantum mechanics can play a role in the warm and complex environment of a living cell. Whereas biologists, well, many biologists simply do not believe quantum mechanics and prefer their balls and sticks models of molecular structure. But it is fair to say that a few years ago, the field suddenly burst into life. For a number of years, biologists had been conducting ever more careful and precise experiments that are allowing them to study biological processes down at the molecular level by using spectroscopic techniques developed by physicists and chemists over the years. Add to this the recent publicity surrounding quantum phenomena that appear to play a major role in a range of biological mechanisms, from photosynthesis and olfaction to magnetoreception in retinas of migrating birds, and suddenly it seemed quantum biology had become of age. John, Joe and I are now part of a growing community of physicists, chemists and biologists carrying out serious research in an exciting new field. But at the back of our minds, we can't help wonder whether we should have been more courageous a decade ago, when the field was clearer. That quote was taken from an article, Quantum Biology Comes of Age, which was online, but the online magazine where it was published is no longer in existence. But it was there, and there is this article and in this article or review of quantum biology, Jim Al-Khalili states about the kind of attitude that was around when he was starting out pondering research in this field. Quantum biology was seen as an outside, rather controversial, somehow wacky area of science. Particularly when you think about some of the ideas that grew up during the late 1960s, late 1970s, when people were using quantum mechanics to describe all sorts of strange phenomena, such as telepathy or ideas in pseudoscience. Quantum mechanics developed this mystical arm. One of the famous examples was the work of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. They proposed a mechanism that they argued explained the nature of consciousness. The idea is that there were these proteins within the neurons of the brain that could exist in a quantum superposition. So it seems when Jim Al-Khalili was initially interested in research and publishing in this area of research, he was probably considered to be a wacky, borderline mystical quantum lunatic of some sort, and so thought better of it. I'm obviously speculating here, but I can't see any other explanation for his admission that he could have been publishing stuff, as he says, a decade before he actually did get round to doing research and publishing material. There was a view at the time that quantum effects could not be operative because the nature of biological organisms, brains and leaves and whatever, were too wet and messy or whatever for quantum mechanisms to apply or to function. So he was persuaded not to go ahead at some point, and only got working seriously at a decade. He was persuaded not to do serious research. He then wrote a book with John Joe McFadden, who he mentions in the article, a molecular biologist, and they wrote an excellent book, Life at the Edge, The Coming Age of Quantum Biology. However, despite the fact that Jim Al-Khalili had been affected in his research by what I call the academic thought police, which had deterred him from pursuing, maybe publishing earlier, his ideas, along with John Joe McFadden, about the quantum mechanisms within the biological realm. Despite the fact that he had been deterred by his colleagues' lack of support and maybe even warning against such endeavours, he has no trepidation in piling in and mildly insulting people who think that research into connections between consciousness and quantum realm might be appropriate. He writes, "I knew as well as anybody just how ready people without an understanding of quantum mechanics tend to be ascribing to all sorts of pseudo-scientific New Age nonsense, from an explanation of human consciousness or homeopathy to extrasensory perception and psychic ability." In the book, Life on the Edge, The Coming Age of Quantum Biology, Al-Khalili and McFadden write the following: "It is certainly not enough to adopt the view, as some have, that consciousness is mysterious and difficult to pin down, and quantum physics is mysterious and difficult to pin down. Therefore the two must be connected in some way." And this is really a parody of what physicists who do indicate a possible connection actually say about the possible connection. And he is acting in exactly the same way as the people who deterred him from making claims about quantum biology. It's extraordinary. If we look at Rosenblum and Kuttner, who wrote the book Quantum Enigma, which is about the quantum connection with consciousness, and they're quite clear about it. And they're qualified quantum physicists, as qualified as Al-Khalili, I believe. Quantum Enigma. Physics encounters consciousness. Physics' encounter with consciousness, demonstrated for the small, applies to everything. And that everything can include the entire universe. Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner. And they also say, consciousness and the quantum enigma are not just two mysteries, they are the two mysteries. First, our physical demonstration of the quantum enigma faces us with the fundamental mystery of the objective world, out there. The second, conscious awareness, faces us with the fundamental mystery of the subjective world, in here. Quantum mechanics seems to connect the two. So these two qualified quantum physicists, like Jim Al-Khalili, have the exact opposite view to Jim Al-Khalili. Did Jim Al-Khalili read these people at any point? In order to give an indication of the experiments that Rosenblum and Kuttner refer to, or their depiction of the essence of the experiments, I will read from a book I'm writing at the moment, Quantum Revelations of the Real and Unreal. This is an exposition of how Kaur Madhyamaka and Yogacara metaphysics can actually throw light on the functioning of quantum reality. Rosenblum and Kuttner, I'll call them R and K. They say that in quantum experiments, when a particle is discovered, in quantum experiments, that the particle or object that is produced when a detector is present and it's being monitored, for example, is produced by the knowledge of which path the quantum phenomenon is taken through the double slits. The object was not there before you found it there. Your happening to find it there caused it to be there. In this depiction, which is quite crude and quite controversial, because they're basically saying that the very act of detecting or trying to detect a particle will produce a particle, whereas before the act of trying to observe or detect the particle, there was only quantum potentiality, immaterial quantum potentiality. So I give this picture just to give an idea of what is being suggested. It's very crude. You have quantum waves of quantum potentiality, an observer looks and ping, you get a particle. A more involved experiment requires that we take a wave of quantum potentiality and we can split it into two boxes. At that point, there is no particle, there is just a quantum field of potentiality. But the quantum field of potentiality is split between the two boxes and doesn't reside anywhere between the boxes. It's possible to do this in quantum experiments. So you've just got a field of potentiality spread between two boxes, but it doesn't exist anywhere outside the boxes. And there is a half probability that the particle will be detected in the first box, and a half probability that it will be detected in the second box. Then when we look, one of two things will happen. Either a particle will be found, in which case the other box will be empty, or a particle will not be found and the particle will be in the box that was not looked at. This is what R and K mean by claiming that you looking caused the particle, the object, to be there, whereas beforehand there was just quantum potentiality. Now this has given rise to kind of new age speculation that somehow the observer is observing or is radiating beams of intentionality. But the fact that you can observe and find a particle not in the box, and the particle appears in the box you did not look in, actually indicates the situation is far more subtle than the idea that I'm creating particles by beaming intentionality. It's not that at all. It's just an act which produces knowledge one way or the other. So it's the actual organising things so that you have knowledge will cause a particle to manifest. In the case of the two boxes, either in the box you're looking at or the one you're not looking at. But it's the act of organising things so that you know. Now, as I mentioned elsewhere, within Buddhism, consciousness can be considered to be a kind of energy force of cognition. It's not some kind of airy-fairy floaty thought thing. At the base level, one can conceive of it as a kind of energy, cognitive force. In its primordial condition, it is a non-dual field of luminous energetic awareness. When it becomes embodied within human beings, its potentiality or its luminosity is stepped down to produce a far less potent, individuated field of awareness. I hope that makes sense. We're talking in Buddhist terms here. I mean, in Buddhist terms, a distinction is made between jhana, jnana, and vijnana. Jhana is primordial awareness. Vijnana is individuated awareness. in my analysis, which I go into in great details in this book, it's not the case that individual beings are beaming rays of intentionality. It's that the energetic force of knowing acting through collectively all sentient beings actually produces both the knowing awareness within sentient beings and collectively produces a material world. I'm kind of given this as a schematic. So primordial awareness is acting through sentient beings, and as it does so, it's actually solidifying the life of each sentient being, and it's producing the environmental material world at the same time. So when you do experiments, and remember the R and K presentation of that experiment is a kind of, what can we say, it's caricatured, but experiments of that type are performed by quantum physicists. But what we're seeing here is basically primordial awareness operating, but it appears as if a single sentient being, in the guise of an experimenter, is somehow responsible for revealing the quantum particle. Here's what Jim Al-Khalili says about the idea that consciousness and the realm of quantum functioning could be in any way connected.
So that, for example, there was the idea that quantum mechanics explains consciousness. You know, consciousness is mysterious. But this notion that, well, consciousness is mysterious, you don't really understand it. Quantum mechanics is mysterious, we don't understand it. Therefore, the two must be connected in some way. That's not how you do science. But we talk about, you know,
that short clip was in the same lecture in which he presented the many worlds theory, in which all sentient beings have been ripped into infinite numbers of themselves at every moment in time, as being a quite serious possibility. And yet consciousness? No. The hugely significant quantum physicist John Bell, 80, 90 years ago, said of the many worlds theory, if it were possible to take that theory seriously, it wouldn't be possible to take anything else seriously whatsoever, or something. Life at the Edge was published in 2014. Quantum Enigma 2006. So Quantum Enigma was published 8 years before. So Al-Khalili had plenty of time to research to see whether there were other physicists who thought differently to him, and maybe look at the evidence they presented and the reasoning they presented. But the situation is such that materialist or materialist-leaning physicists generally don't feel they need to present any analysis and counter-argument as to why they're so dismissive of the idea that consciousness could be involved. And the reason for that is they just don't believe consciousness is much of a significant ingredient in the process of reality. It seems like an extraordinary opinion to hold, and it is an opinion, it's not based on any evidence. to be controversial, I honestly believe that it's because they'd never experienced the deeper levels of consciousness. If you experience the non-dual luminosity which is experienced in jhana meditation, for example, you probably have a different feeling or a different understanding of, what can you say, the energy. But it's not a material energy. It is, as I say, a force of luminous awareness and cognition. He doesn't present any reasoning behind his bland assertion. And there are quite a few quantum physicists who disagree with Jim Al-Khalili. Roger Penrose states, almost all the conventional interpretations of quantum mechanics ultimately depend upon the presence of a perceiving being. As far as I can make out, the only interpretations that do not necessarily depend upon some notion of conscious observer require some fundamental change in the rules of quantum mechanics. Wojciech Zurek, very, very important quantum physicist. The ultimate evidence for the choice of one alternative, quantum alternative, resides in our elusive consciousness. Physicist and philosopher Bernard Despanet. The doctrine that the world is made up of objects whose existence is independent of human consciousness turns out to be in conflict with quantum mechanics and with facts established by experiment. Henry Stapp. We live in an idea-like world, not a matter-like world. The quantum cosmologist, André Linde. Is it possible that consciousness, like space-time, has its own intrinsic degrees of freedom, and that neglecting these will lead to a description of the universe that is fundamentally incomplete? What if our perceptions are as real as, or maybe, in a certain sense, even more real than material objects? And the Russian, highly qualified, easily as qualified as Jim Al-Khalili, physicist Michael Mensky wrote, the phenomena of life and consciousness cannot be mechanistically reduced to the action of the laws of science as they are found in the course of exploring inanimate matter. The explanation of these phenomena on the basis of quantum mechanics requires the addition of a special independent element to the set of quantum concepts and laws. Such a new element of theory should directly connect quantum concepts with the concepts characteristic of life. The simplest way to find this element is to consider the phenomena of consciousness and compare it with the description of observation, measurement, in quantum mechanics. Now, Michael Mensky was writing about quantum functioning and mechanisms in biology, probably unknown to Jim Al-Khalili, either before or at the same time. But whereas Jim Al-Khalili thinks that quantum biology has nothing to do with consciousness, as if life has nothing to do with consciousness, Mensky clearly considers that quantum physics, life and consciousness are all connected, and we'll go into this. Here's another quote from Mensky. Life and consciousness are not the direct consequence of these processes, mechanistic processes that is. Life is not a function of the body, and consciousness is not a function of the brain. Rather, the body is a realization of life, and the brain is an instrument of consciousness. What Mensky is saying is that consciousness acts at the quantum level to produce the body and the brain in order to take up residence, as it were, within a material world. The body and the brain are instruments of consciousness so that it can explore its own nature. This is Mensky's proposal, and he goes into this proposal in great detail. Now let's take a look at an example of one of the mechanisms which involves quantum phenomenon, in this case quantum coherence, within a biological setting, in this case photosynthesis.
Another example of quantum mechanics in biology is quantum coherence, in one of the most important processes in biology, photosynthesis. Plants and bacteria taking sunlight and using that energy to create biomass. Quantum coherence is the idea of quantum entities multitasking. An object that behaves like a wave so that it doesn't just move in one direction or the other, but can follow multiple pathways at the same time. Some years ago, the world of science was shocked when a paper was published showing experimental evidence that quantum coherence takes place inside bacteria carrying out photosynthesis. The idea is that the photon, the particle of light, the sunlight, the quantum of light, captured by a chlorophyll molecule, is then delivered to what's called the reaction center, where it can be turned into chemical energy. And in getting there, it doesn't just follow one route, it follows multiple pathways at once to optimize the most efficient way of reaching the reaction center without dissipating as waste heat.
This means that a transfer of energy to the reaction center takes place at the immaterial, multiple potential quantum level. The immaterial, coherent quantum wave-like field of exploration can test out all possible paths for the energy transfer. This is because the quantum wave can explore as many paths as it needs to. You can explore every path before choosing which is the most efficient path. So all paths of possible energy transfer are explored at the immaterial quantum level, and then the most efficient is selected instantaneously. This is how photosynthesis works. photosynthesis, which operates at a quantum level, has a look-ahead mechanism to see which path of transfer is the most efficient. Photosynthesis then looks like a programmed, intelligent behaviour. Materialists, if they were watching, but they're unlikely to be, would be tearing their hair out at this point. Perhaps screaming that I was misusing language, calling the quantum level immaterial. But, as we have seen, materialists are conditioned by the fact that they know in their hearts, as the materialist quantum physicist Sean Carroll has admitted, which I showed you in a previous video. They know in their heart, not through experimental evidence, they know in their heart the world is just mindless matter and consciousness is just some kind of weird mistake or efflorescence, but it's not really essential, it's nothing really. Matter is everything. For your materialist. And because of this, materialists have no problem actually adopting completely incoherent logical chains of reasoning and explanations when it comes to metaphysics. The quantum field is clearly immaterial. The word material really goes back to Descartes. Matter is continuous solid substance, not wavy fields of immaterial quantum potentiality, or not. Ghostly is the word that Jim Al-Khalili uses in his definition. Ghostly stuff is not material. However, even though at the quantum level, we can see this intelligent-like behaviour. I'm not saying it's, full-blown consciousness. I'm just saying there's a kind of intelligence built into the photosynthesis mechanism. And we also know from various experiments, such as the double slit experiment, especially when one particle is sent through at a time, with detectors switched on and off, which shows you when consciousness or when the mind knows which detector or which slit the particle is going to go through, the wave of potentiality becomes a particle. So clearly the knowingness of consciousness interacts with the quantum field. It's only if you're determined to ignore the evidence that you can't see there's something going on here. So we've got photosynthesis, shows mind-like behaviour. We've got double slits experiments and various other quantum experiments, shows interconnection with mind. I'm not saying that we intentionally can do things at the quantum level with our individual minds. I'm just saying there's a relationship to mind. However, materialists will ignore all this and say, no, it's an immaterial field. It's an immaterial field, has no elements of consciousness whatsoever. Even to claim there are elements of consciousness makes you into a woo-woo merchant and probably a lunatic who should be locked up. So we got this mindless, according to materialists, quantum field, then produces an even more mindless material field. Matter is just matter, solid bits of stuff banging around, no consciousness there whatsoever. And then magically, when this stuff gets to our brains, consciousness. It makes no sense. No consciousness, no consciousness. Oh, this is an incoherent logical chain of explanation. Why? Because a new quality suddenly leaps into existence at the top level of explanation, which has no grounding in the chains beneath, or in the levels beneath in the chain of reasoning. When we understand that the immaterial quantum field must have a quality of consciousness in some sense, and it is an internal operation within the field of quantum potentiality that produces both matter and mind, which are related together, then we see that there's a completely coherent connection from what we are looking at the base level. The quantum field has both immaterial, it is immaterial, but can give rise to individualized mind because it has an inner nature of consciousness, non-dual consciousness, and it gives the appearance of a material world. And you must keep in mind the material world is only just existent. It is over 99.5% empty space. The quantum physicist Nick Herbert says the following: every quantum system has both an inside and an outside, and that consciousness, both in humans as well as in other sentient beings, is identical to the inner experience of some quantum system. A quantum system's outside behaviour is described by quantum theory. Its inside experience is the subject matter of a new inner physics. Well, as I show in my book Quantum Buddhism, the claimed new inner physics actually already existed in Yogacara, Madhyamaka, Dzogchen, and Mahamudra Buddhism, which traditions, metaphysical and practice traditions, knew this stuff metaphysically. They didn't know the Schrödinger wave equation, they weren't interested. They were interested in experiencing the inner qualities of pristine luminous awareness which resides within the quantum ground. The reason that physicists don't know about this, or rather the materialist physicists, is they just look at the outside, i.e. what's described by the mathematics of quantum theory. They look at something like photosynthesis, where there's clearly a manifestation of programmed intelligent behaviour. The unfolding is far more intelligent than that. It's unfolding. Photosynthesis is the most important energy transformation process that keeps the biological world going. Transforms the sun's sunlight energy into food for the organic world. Takes CO2 in from the air, puts oxygen back out for sentient beings to breathe. This is all down to photosynthesis. But as I say, the materialist physicist just looks at the outside and says, well, there's nothing more to it. But when you see that intelligence and then you realise the interconnection demonstrated in quantum experiments, where primordial awareness interacts with wave functions to create at that deep level, parts of the material world, you can see that there is an inside and an outside. The minds of sentient beings are a dimmed down inside of the primordial awareness which resides in the basic quantum field. The hugely important quantum physicist David Bohm, and I've just written a book about David Bohm, the Tibetan Book of the Undivided Universe. I'm very, very pleased with this book. I have a friend who's a very advanced quantum physicist and Buddhist practitioner. He reckons this is a definitive work on David Bohm and Buddhism. There is nothing like it, but anyway. David Bohm tells us that consciousness has to be understood in terms of an order that is closer to the implicate, and David Bohm used the word implicate for the quantum field. Question is whether or not the actual substance of consciousness can be understood in terms of the notion that the implicate order is also its primary and immediate actuality. In other words, David Bohm is also telling us that consciousness is the immediate experience of the quantum field. And again, David Bohm says, it is thus implied that in some sense a rudimentary mind-like quality is present even at the level of particle physics. And that as we go to subtler levels, this mind-like quality becomes stronger and more developed. If you read materialist quantum physicists, what you get is ideological propaganda, which does not actually tell you that there are many physicists who are thinking in these kind of terms, that the quantum field have qualities of internal consciousness and the ability to manifest the appearance of materiality. Completely different to what the materialist physicists would want you to believe. They don't talk about these other New Age people as if the only people who thought that consciousness was significant were New Age lunatics. It's just not true. There are highly qualified, very intelligent physicists who come to completely opposite conclusions to the materialist physicists. And if you analyse their claims carefully, with evidential and logical rigour, the claims of physicists who suggest that the quantum field must have an internal aspect of conscious awareness, an inner kind of energetic consciousness which unfolds the potentialities into the appearance of material world, the reasoning is far more profound than anything you find in materialist quarters. And I've analysed just about a lot. I'm serious. I've been at this for about 20 years now. Sometimes, weeks I'll spend every day doing it because I find it fascinating. It's fascinating to see all the what you say, deceptive manoeuvres of the materialists, and anyway, I may do a video just on that. I mean, there are some less prominent materialist physicists such as Jean Bricmont, but even he goes into just kind of, sort of howls of despair at people like David Bohm, John Wheeler, Henry Stapp. He doesn't actually give any effective, precise reasoning. He just doesn't like consciousness, as far as I can see. It's very odd. It's like all these materialist physicists and philosophers don't even like their own minds. Very odd. We must move on to talk about the brilliant Russian physicist Michael Mensky, who actually took the mechanism of photosynthesis and widened it out to show that you could apply it to many levels of conscious functioning and also to evolution. This is astonishing stuff, Michael Mensky. I shall finish this video, which has gone over an hour, by just outlining some of the insights and proposals made by the Russian physicist Michael Mensky, and I shall primarily be referring to the book I wrote about Mensky, Quantum Path to Enlightenment. Michael Mensky. Michael B. Mensky was a physicist and professor working at the Lebedev Physical Institute of the Academy of Science in Moscow. He worked in fields such as quantum field theory, quantum gravity, quantum theory of measurement, and the foundations of quantum physics. His interest in the foundations of and metaphysical implications of quantum theory led him to having spectacular insights into the relationship between quantum theory and the mystical claims of some religions. And Mensky wrote technical papers in the fields of quantum field theory, quantum gravity, and the quantum theory of measurement. He did not just write papers on quantum theory and mystical aspects of some religions. Now, he proposed what he called the extended Everett concept. What he meant by this was he accepted that at the quantum level there are many worlds of possible experience. This is clearly indicated by the nature of quantum reality, wherein there are multiple possible worlds of experience which are there in the quantum field as potentiality. What Mensky did not accept was that every sentient being was being divided up every moment in time into an infinite number of themselves, whatever that could possibly mean, thus rapidly becoming infinities upon infinities upon infinities upon infinities of themselves, all in different worlds. So what did he say on this issue? Mensky wrote about the many worlds theory as follows. Not only does the many worlds picture excessively dramatize the situation, but may also mislead, and quite often does so. In reality, no many classical worlds exist at all. There is only one world, and this is a quantum world, and it is in a superposition state. It is simply that every component of a superposition, taken separately, corresponds to what our consciousness perceives as the picture of a classical world. And to different superposition terms there corresponds different pictures. What we call a classical Everett world is just one classical projection of the quantum world. These different projections are produced by the observer's consciousness, perceiving the quantum world subjectively, while the quantum world exists independently of whatever observer, i.e. the quantum world exists objectively. So what Mensky is suggesting really is that what we perceive as a classical reality is in fact just the way a particular subjective mind perceives a quantum world. As consciousness interacts with the quantum world, it experiences the appearance of a classical reality. So there are many potential classical, i.e. apparent material worlds at the quantum level, and consciousness, which is an internal, let's say, cognitive force within the quantum world, is moving through the quantum world of many possibilities, and it is selecting one of those possibilities to experience. Now, when Mensky talks about Everett, he's talking about Hugh Everett, who proposed the many worlds theory. So the Everett's many world theory is basically the original Everett's many world theory, wherein there just are many worlds. End of story. In Everett's interpretation, there appears to be some ambiguity. All alternatives are realized, and the observer's consciousness splits between all alternatives. This is the Everett's world as presented actually by Bryce DeWitt, who indicated that observers were actually splitting inside the many worlds. At the same time, the individual observers subjectively perceive what is going on in such a way as there exists a single alternative, the one he exists in. In other words, consciousness as a whole splits between the alternatives, but the individual consciousness chooses, selects one alternative. So here he's proposing his modification to the Everett's world, which is that the subjectivity, the consciousness of a particular observer will select a route and thus experience one world. All the other worlds are not experienced by this observer. The observer does not split. Furthermore, and this is important, according to Mensky, all observers see the same thing. Their observations are consistent with each other. Because there are levels of consciousness beneath that of the one subjective observer we, I, you, and other sentient beings are associated with, there's also collective levels of consciousness. So those collective levels are operating beneath the operation of the higher levels of individuated subjective awareness. So there's a complex, multifaceted, if you like, hierarchy of levels of consciousness moving through the many worlds of quantum potentiality. Which means actually the possible degrees of selection of an individual observer are actually constrained by the collective level. One example of the collective level would be the species level. So as I, or a human being, are moving through the many worlds, unconsciously at a deep conscious level, I'm selecting the experience of a human being. My body maintains integrity because primordial mind, which is determining my movement, as it were, at the deepest level, is maintaining collectively that I am in a human body, and I'm experiencing the collective world of my fellow human beings. We share the collective environment. Now, the explanation and elucidation I've just given you, Mensky clearly realized was entirely consistent with certain spiritual perspectives, especially those within Buddhism. He writes, "The previous reasoning followed a certain logic, but the only concept from a spiritual practice which was used in this consideration was the concept of soul and the life of a soul after death of the body. Now we will see that the conclusion achieved in a purely logical way can be interpreted as describing the ideas of Hinduism and Buddhism about karma and reincarnation. This is because in Mensky's perspective, his new extended Everett concept, which has a spiritual dimension, he conceives that consciousness is the primary energetic force moving through the quantum realm, and that the interconnected structure of consciousness, which is associated with the body, does not dissipate once the body dissipates, but continues to move through the quantum potentialities, experiencing an after-death state, which is completely consistent with the idea, Buddhist idea, of the bardo realms. These are the states which are experienced by the disembodied consciousness, would be experienced as a dream state, conditioned by actions and experiences within the embodied state previously vacated, as it were. So here is a Buddhist mind-only perspective on the functioning of reality. The mind is the principal creator of everything because sentient beings accumulate predisposing potencies through their actions, and these actions are directed by mental motivation. These potencies are what create not only their own lives, but also the physical world around them. All environments are formed by karma, that is, actions and the potencies they establish. The wind, the sun, earth, trees, what is enjoyed, used and suffered, all are produced from actions. This completely accords and is consistent with the Mensky viewpoint. You have this overall movement of consciousness. At the higher level, there are sentient beings who are making decisions for themselves, and those decisions are leaving traces within the universal consciousness, which is called within Yogacara Buddhism the Alaya Vijnana, the ground consciousness or the store consciousness. These become quantum potentialities in Mensky's terminology. And they will produce further experiences at later moments in time. Experiences of a common collective world, which are experienced and enjoyed, so to speak, by an enormous collection of sentient beings, will leave a collective trace, and that will actually keep the manifestation or the illusion of a manifestation of a collective world operating as the entire force of primordial consciousness moves through the quantum realm of potentiality. According to Mensky, while consciousness cannot be understood in the context of chemistry, classical physics and physiology, as we've seen, the ordinary classical materialist view asserts consciousness does not exist within matter. The definition of matter, actually, as I said, goes back to Descartes. It is unthinking, unconscious, non-conscious. So the claim that consciousness can suddenly be accounted for is logical incoherence, or rather, I should say, illogical incoherence. While consciousness cannot be accounted for in a materialist, or often they like to use the term physicalist, to pretend they're kind of a new, more subtle type of materialist. But physicalism still doesn't involve consciousness. Mensky continues, it turns out it can be understood in the context of quantum mechanics. More precisely, the essence of consciousness can be interpreted as a special type of perception of quantum reality by living beings. Again, Mensky tells us that quantum mechanics attempts to represent the measurement process as completely objective, as absolutely independent of the observer who perceives the result of the measurement. Such attempts have not met with success. The description of quantum measurements must involve the observer, or, to be precise, the observer's consciousness. Now, one would have thought at this point, well, this Michael Mensky, he must be some kind of raving religious nutter. He must be religious. I'm sure he's a Buddhist and he's just trying to mislead us. Well, Andrei Terentiev wrote an article about Michael Mensky's work in this field, and he wrote about the connections between Buddhism and physics, well, quantum physics. But this is with particular reference to Michael Mensky. I'd like to stress that we are not just considering analogies in different fields of human endeavour. In fact, both Buddhist thinkers and modern physicists, using very different methods, arrive basically at the same description of the reality we live in. This is the point where the parallel worlds of Buddhism and physics unexpectedly touched each other, and the deeper meaning of this is yet to be appreciated by both parties. Now, when I contacted Andrei Terentiev, and I had some correspondence with him, I asked him, I said, well, you know, I imagine Michael Mensky must have been a very religious man. And he said, no, not at all. He had no religious belief of his own. He just saw that the findings of quantum physics and these aspects of religious philosophies, especially Hinduism and Buddhism, were saying, or rather, the quantum mechanics, quantum physics aspects were in line with the claims of mystical religious perspectives. So, what Mensky is implying or saying is that consciousness sees the separation into the various worlds and selects a way through, experiencing only one. And he writes, if consciousness is identified with the separation of the alternatives, then turning consciousness off means the disappearance of this separation, which is the emergence of access to all alternative realities. Now here sometimes Mensky actually uses consciousness in an ambiguous way. Here he's meaning consciousness as the more individuated experiencing level of individuated consciousness. If you turn the higher individual aspects of consciousness off, there's still a deeper levels of the unconscious consciousness and primordial consciousness functioning within the quantum realm. So if individuated consciousness is turned off, as in dream state, for example, then deeper layers of consciousness has access to the entire quantum realm, including other worlds, the other worlds of possibility. The information from this enormous database makes feasible, in the state of unconsciousness, super intuition, the direct vision of the truth. Thus, extraordinary features of consciousness should be revealed at the edge of consciousness. Here you must understand this kind of double meaning of consciousness, i.e. consciousness as individuated consciousness and consciousness as a deeper level, which you have to interpret this. when Freud and Jung, for instance, used the term unconscious, they didn't mean that it was unconscious in the sense of a complete blankness. They meant there was the individual level of consciousness was turned off. The unconscious state was a less individuated level of consciousness functioning. When the consciousness, which is the separation of the alternatives, disappears or almost disappears, what is accessed is superconsciousness or extended consciousness, and consciousness has the ability to influence the alternative to be subjectively perceived. And this is Mensky talking about the quantum mechanism seen in photosynthesis acting within the functioning of consciousness within the quantum realm in general. The look-ahead mechanism exhibited in photosynthesis, Mensky indicates, is a fundamental mechanism of consciousness in general. This is an extraordinary and vitally important insight. He calls this post-correction. Post-correction operates in the following way. At the level of non-individuated consciousness, consciousness is able to look ahead into where quantum possibilities are in the future in the quantum realms of possibility, just as the photosynthesis exploration of all possible energy pathways happens at the quantum level. And in the same way that photosynthesis selects the most appropriate pathway, consciousness can select a pathway into the future. This must be pondered with great seriousness. Mensky writes, "We shall introduce the mathematical formalism describing the principal feature of living matter, of its consciousness, the ability to correct its state, making use of information about the efficient way of survival obtained from the future. It will be assumed that the evolution mechanism of living matter includes a look-ahead correction mechanism providing survival at distant moments. This correction leaves in the sphere of life only those scenarios of evolution that are favourable for life." And this explains how evolution functions with the photosynthetic look-ahead mechanism functioning actually at a deeper level. as the Hawking-Lotino description of the many-world scenario tells us, all possible events, experiences, manifestations occur at the dawn of time in quantum potentiality. This means that the possible designs for all species, all animals, resides at the quantum level at the dawn of time. According to Mensky, there is this look-ahead mechanism operating at the quantum level, looking ahead into what can happen in the future quantum scenarios to unfold the most efficient survival mechanism and also the most viable animal species. The Darwinian worldview is always nonsense. The idea that randomness produces, the interconnected, fine-tuned, interrelational biological world could have been known to be nonsense in the early 20th century. But as I've said, and I'll say it, academic corruption, egos and need for paychecks meant that nobody was going to give up the nonsense they'd been preaching and misleading their students about. Animal species were unfolded by the post-corrective quantum look-ahead mechanism. When I do the video on Mensky, I'll go into this in much greater detail. Another quantum physicist who supports and goes into detail on this is Amit Goswami. And also the discoveries of the Evo-Devo revolution, which clearly states that all templates for animal species resides within the quantum realm at the dawn of time. But they try and pretend that the Evo-Devo revolution is supportive of Darwin, of the Darwinian perspective, when the opposite is clearly the case. Now, the unfavourable scenarios which are left aside by this look-ahead mechanism, they don't just disappear, they remain as possible, but they just don't come into manifest experienced reality. They don't come into the domain of the apparent material world. And Mensky's view is entirely consistent with the Hawking-Lotino viewpoint, where, according to Hawking-Lotino, this effect takes place backwards in time. As I say, Mensky calls this post-correction in the sense that consciousness at various levels can look ahead into the quantum futures. Then when it comes back, it post-corrects and sets its course dependent upon the most advantageous path, exactly as in photosynthesis. This also explains apparent miracles, and miracles do occur. There are occurrences where extraordinary events which defy explanation occur and seem to be the result of things like group prayer, for example. It doesn't mean that it will always work, because it depends on a lot of other intervening factors. Buddhism calls this karma. Mensky calls this. Mensky describes the post-corrective process. Unconscious or superconscious states of mind allows one to take information from other alternatives within the quantum sphere that reveals unexpected insights or direct visions of the truth. This explains such events as mathematicians having insights seemingly coming from other realms, for example. Or visions of the benzene ring in a dream, or it was actually I think it was in a waking dream. I can't remember who it appeared to, never mind. People do have direct visions or insights, seemingly coming from other realms. These things do occur. Probabilistic miracles essentially differ from absolute miracles that happen in fairy tales. In other words, in fairy tales, there's kind of direct, Merlin or whatever, a person can definitely do miracles by the force of their own minds. Probabilistic miracles occur. The difference is that the event is realized as a probabilistic miracle by the force of consciousness, can happen in a natural way, although with a small probability. There is a small but non-zero probability within the quantum realm that all events, all possible events, can happen. However, consciousness can alter the weightings within the quantum realm to select a quantum possibility which is not the most probable one. It can amplify a possible event to make it the actual event. So there is a force of consciousness, but it's not the case that it's not the case that it's always effective. There are other possibilities which intervene. But when miracles do occur, it's because consciousness can alter the weightings of quantum probabilities to a small degree. So, to round off this concluding, hopefully mind-blowing or inspirational insight into Michael Mensky's worldview, quantum worldview. In summary, Mensky identifies the following aspects or levels of the functioning of the quantum post-correction mechanism. The ability to look ahead at deep, consciously unconscious levels into future quantum probabilities and select the most favourable, and then steer a course, as in photosynthesis. This post-corrective mechanism functions in life. The internal pressure of primordial consciousness acting through quantum potentialities which motivates the evolution of the apparently material world and the organic beings contained within it. This is me describing the spheres that Mensky identifies. Survival. The natural unconscious operation of post-correction in the survival processes of species and individual animals. The post-correction mechanism involves the ability of consciousness to employ defocused superconsciousness or subconsciousness, it depends on the way you're looking at it, to look ahead at future quantum potentialities and then alter current probabilities in order to steer towards favourable quantum scenarios. Support of health. Unconscious operation of post-correction in determining the quality of health for an individual organism. Free will. Conscious operation of post-correction in determining the quality of life and life improvement for an individual organism. This is the use of intentionality in the decision-making processes. And again, in Buddhism, there's always a degree of free will, but we don't have absolute free will. It's very unlikely, my consciousness will look ahead and decide to turn me into an amoeba, for example. These quantum look-ahead processes are limited in their mode of operation and their extent of operation. In the control of appearing reality, probabilistic miracles. Post-correction relating to objects external to the body. This is the ability of some people to seemingly cause events in their environments which have low, although low zero probabilities. Super-intuitional insights. Insights, foresights, and direct sighting of truth from the edge of consciousness, due to the operation of the superconsciousness or subconsciousness. Which of these terms one's used depends on the context. In dreams, you're more likely to call it subconscious. In the waking state, you're more likely to call it super intuition, for example. That overview and exposition of some of the ideas of Michael Mensky was intended, hopefully, to give a taste and give some preliminary insight into the extraordinary insights that Mensky had, and which, when you actually look into the evidence at the quantum level, functioning of quantum physics, and Mensky does do that, this is why these mechanisms will work and must be operating, and then look at the evidence from, for example, Irreducible Mind. Well, this is just an extraordinary book which surveys in great detail by experts. And you can look at the original papers and see the research indicating that what Mensky calls probabilistic miracles do occur. And the way that materialists try to debunk this kind of evidence is just laughable. When you go into this in great detail, you find that a whole new extraordinary worldview, which is not an airy-fairy, overblown, new age, over-the-top perspective, but is more detailed much more remarkable in many senses because it has more detail, more force behind it. I was looking at a New Age video. It's probably Deepak Chopra. It says, "Your mind is limitless." Well, actually most people's minds are not limitless because they're constrained by karma, they're constrained by the need for their everyday activities, and the kind of meditation practices you have to undergo to activate and experience the limitlessness of mind are quite hard for most people. So claims like this, oh, the mind is limitless, just read this book and you experience limitless mind, are overblown and misleading. Nevertheless, when you understand the truth of such stuff, the truth of the implications of quantum functioning, the ways that the mind can look ahead into quantum potentiality and steer ahead within limits, you begin to see the truth of the world is far more subtle and inspiring without needing to go over the top and make overinflated claims. But as I say, the way I presented Mensky was slightly breathless, just to give you a taste. I will do a video. By breathless I mean not giving you the full detail to understand. It will take more time to understand fully the claims, but if you understood what I was indicating there, you'll get an idea of the Mensky worldview. I'm also aware that I'm very kind of, what should we say, I'm very scathing about certain aspects of the behaviour of some academics and academic life in general. I would like to tell you a small detail, a couple of details from my own life to explain this to a certain extent. Towards the end of my studies at Sussex University, I was talking to my professor, Preston Bose, who was head of religious studies department at that time. Extraordinarily remarkable woman. I regretted afterwards losing touch with her, but she went back to India. But anyway, she said to me, "Graham, you must get a lectureship. This is what you should be doing with your life." And she said, "There's a lectureship in Singapore, I'll put you forward for it." And I just didn't want to leave Britain. It's something I regret now very much. But also there are certain aspects of academic life, certain things I'd observed within academia, which I just did not like. It was just not, and one of them was people would toe any nonsense if it was required by what I call the academic thought police, or the ethos of the time. And I remember later on, a couple of years, I was teaching maths and physics at a local college, and there was a guy from Sussex University who was in the consciousness studies department, and he was writing his thesis. And I was looking at him, looking at what he's writing, and he was saying that he was writing down it certainly appears that consciousness has a validity and a realm of its own, that it could be an ontological aspect of reality. But we must resist this temptation at all costs. And I said, well, you know, what's your argument for that? I mean, it's all right you saying that, but doesn't philosophy require you to actually give an argument? And I said, I know, but you see, this is the department line, and if you don't toe this line, you won't get your MA. And this is true. This is often how academia functions. Now, it can't function like this in all subjects, of course, because if you're doing physics, actual physics, experimental physics, or theoretical physics, then mathematics has its own internal coherence, and experiments basically do give experimental outcomes. Once you get into the realm of less precise areas of discourse and exploration, like the social sciences and philosophy, and even interpretations of quantum theory, the academic thought police can get a grip.